Go ahead and hit record now. All right. We also ask that you mute yourselves at this time. Once again, welcome. Thank you all for attending today's session. My name is Joe Lee, and I, along with my colleagues Jasmine Shoemaker and Lorraine Ojo Ohaikwari, founded the Symposium series AI, Privacy, and Ethics, Oh My, unpacking the questions surrounding artificial intelligence in higher education. This symposium's inspiration comes from the ever-changing landscape of AI and the need to know information for students regarding higher education. This symposium supports the university's vision of supporting excellence in higher education by connecting innovative teaching, learning, and research. We were intentional with the selection of our speakers, remaining mindful to include librarians, teaching faculty, and students from diverse backgrounds. Our series would not be possible without the contributions of the following centers, departments, and organizations: the Library Freedom Project, UMBC's Center for Social Science Scholarship, the Department of Information Systems, and the Department of Computer Science and Electrical Engineering. Thank you very much for your sponsorship. Today, we welcome Raymond Pun, our second speaker of the series. Ray Pun, pronouns he, him, is the academic and research librarian at the Alder Graduate School of Education, a teacher residency program in California where he supports library services by engaging with residents and teacher educators. With over 17 years of experience in the library field, Ray has previously worked at Stanford University, Fresno State, New York University Shanghai, and the New York Public Library in various roles. Ray holds a doctorate in education from Fresno State, a Master of Library Science from the City University of New York, Queens College, a Master of Arts in East Asian Studies, and a Bachelor of Arts in History from St. John's University. He has previously served as president of the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association and the Chinese American Librarians Association, and on the American Library Association Council as a counselor at large. Currently, he is a candidate for the American Library Association's president for 2025 to 2026. Ray's presentation will be an interview session titled "The Librarian is In: Q&A with Ray Pun on all things AI." We will pause after the first 4 questions and give attendees a chance to ask any questions of their own that they may have. Then we will close the interview with a final space for any additional questions. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us, Ray. We appreciate you making the time to be here. Um, you have written and presented prolifically about Gen AI and ChatGPT in education and libraries. So with that, we'll jump right into the first question. What is your experience regarding your work and research in AI and privacy?
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. I want to just thank everyone for making time for attending the session. I want to thank Joe, Jasmine, Lorraine, and so many other folks from University of Maryland, Baltimore libraries organizing this, and with Library Freedom Project sponsoring. It's really a great opportunity for us to come together and talk about this topic that a lot of people are trying to separate themselves, but seem to be entangled in so many different ways. I wanted to preface that I am not an expert in AI or Gen AI or any of these technologies, but like all of us here, very curious, very determined to figure out what can we do to proactively ensure that we have some considerations in terms of how we think about this issue that's emerging and has emerged in our spaces where we are completely vulnerable to a lot of these commercializations. So someone has been thinking about this for quite some time. I had a chance to write about attending several conferences in 2019 for online searcher. And what I noticed was this is before the pandemic that there were tons of conversations about AI already, right? And Gen AI is a sub AI, right? It's a subfield. So when what we were seeing at the time in 2019 was a lot of discussions about interest in embedding AI features like chatbots that we were seeing in terms of supporting virtual reference, metadata indexing, OCR, optical character recognitions for digitization work, and also for like the features of ensuring that people understand that there's potential in using AI. So there was a lot of excitement. But then now we're seeing the subfield or sub area like AI, Gen AI coming in and encroaching on our spaces. And so what happened was in 2022, when in the fall, when the ChatGPT, OpenAI released it. It kind of went, kind of explosive in a way, got people pretty excited. And so I work with teachers, as Joe mentioned in the introduction. And so one of the things I had been thinking about is what are we doing to prepare our future teachers about these issues? So now for instance, there's a new bill that just potentially is coming up, a proposal to include AI with media literacy, because in California, there's a requirement for media literacy in the curriculum. So now we're seeing a lot of interest from the legislation, and that's going to have impact in the curriculum in terms of instructional materials. And so I talked with several of my colleagues, and then we decided to come together and do a AI usage statement guideline, which we'll talk about. But I just wanted to be prefacing this that I'm not an expert. I think all of us here, this is a conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions, and maybe some people might be able to answer them better than I can, because it's one that the technology is constantly evolving. There's a lot of different takes, hot takes, a lot of thoughts and confusion, and part of it is trying to stay on top of it. So I ended up doing a free webinar in February of 2023 last year for the Lifelong Learning Information Literacy group known as Lily, and this was an open webinar for free just to look at like how this tool is being used and potentially supporting emergent bilinguals, people whose native language is not English, while they go to school and then they develop the English skills, or for accessibility purposes, but also like the difficult issues that we in library spaces, all of us as library workers talk about, which might be surveillance, the biases that are coming out, the hallucination. And during that webinar, it was like hundreds of people attended, and we, bounced ideas, shared how do we align this with the Association of College and Research Libraries Information Literacy Framework. So it was still pretty new, and then from there, people had been asking me to write more or talk or be in a panel. So not a technologist by training, really, but like all of us here, really curious about the technology that's affecting our work. But I've definitely read some works about AI as an ALA book list reviewer. So, for instance, this wasn't in the book list, but Dr. Fei Li from Stanford University, a renowned computer scientist who wrote a book, like a memoir, really reflecting on her experience with AI. The Worlds I See is a really good one, or Amy Webb from NYU has written a lot of stuff about the future in AI. And then I started attending more conferences virtually, and there's been a lot more discussions about it. So my experience is I do want to say it's actually quite limited compared to some other folks who are doing the actual deep research, the programming, the framework. But I think I'm coming in from a practitioner lens, and as someone who cares deeply about the field, like all of us here, we want to ensure that our values are not in conflict with the technologies, but rather sort of understanding what are the trade-offs, right? And how do we make it work, because it's not going away. So that's sort of a gist or summary of that question about my experience, research, and work. And I did want to also preface that before taking this role as a teacher educator, as a librarian, I worked at Stanford University in the Hoover Institution, Library and Archives, and this was like 2022, and we were testing out a chatbot, a recommendation system. So my colleague, Kirill, at the time, he created a chatbot where you can ask questions like, I want to see special collections by African American folks, right? And then it would generate like a list of boxes that would be available, and makes some connections that other people have used in relations to like this collection, right? Or collections about Nazi Germany, because that's what the collection extensively held, and so they would make these connections on what other researchers had used. So it was sort of really cool to see that kind of recommendation system being applied in 2022, potentially as a trial test. So I was part of that group to sort of like look into it. But in general, those are my experiences and thoughts I wanted to share to this question.
Wow, thank you so much. You claim that you're not an expert, but it seems like you have plenty of experience with AI and testing, which is so cool. And the fact that you're bringing this into libraries is also really amazing. Next slide, please. So, as you mentioned, there's been lots of conversation around AI being also this great equalizer, that tech can level the playing field for many students and teens from various backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, especially for those who come from underrepresented or marginalized communities. What are some concerns you have that you feel students should be aware of regarding AI tools and ChatGPT as this becomes more available for students to use?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear folks too share that in the chat box. If you have some concerns, feel free to share them. And Joe and everyone, thank you for such a important question. I think of a couple of things. I think of the issues of our work, our labor as library workers. So I'm thinking of you, Joe, and others who shared in the interlibrary loan, because as I mentioned, there's this hallucination factor. And what I'm seeing from some resource sharing folks is that they end up getting the request and they spend time searching on WorldCat and the others and they don't exist. So you end up like spending time doing that. And I just wanted to do a check-in with you, Joe. Has that happened yet? Or
That absolutely has. I've definitely gotten a number of requests where the citation just doesn't seem right, and I'll start doing some research, doing a deep dive, and it turns out the journal doesn't exist, or it'll pull the right author, but the article they haven't written an article about whatever it is that the request is asking for. So you're absolutely right.
yeah, so thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm sorry that has happened because that's creating an additional labor, right? And time and bandwidth from your end. And is there something we could do later to like verify? That's a separate conversation. But I'm seeing that concern. I'm seeing it happening on virtual reference, right? A lot of people are like, what? This doesn't exist. And then realizing that the student or the faculty or whoever, right, use the tool to get that recommendation. And collection development. Like I was talking to Robin Bradford, who's at Pierce County library system in Washington, like her work is on collection development, and that is affecting her too, where it's like these falsified titles are coming in and like people want them to be added, but they don't exist, right? And so forth, or potentially. And this happened also like I think last week. So I'm also an adjunct instructor for the Pasadena City College Library Technology Program. So it's a certification program for community college students who are trying to get their library technology certification. And what we found was that I had a fellow colleague who was also an adjunct faculty member reached out and said, "Hey Ray, you wrote so many articles. I want this article." And then I said, "Oh, what's the name of the title?" And they were like, "Oh, here it is." And I'm like, "I don't think so because I've never written anything on customer service." And they wrote, "Oh, ChatGPT lied to me. I'm sorry." And I was like, what? Like kind of surprised, like that the large language models, which we'll get into, hasn't been as up to as sort of like a effective way to like get something that's like verified. And so that was kind of like interesting moment there. But I do want to say for those who are teaching, for those who are in the instruction side, especially the faculty, I think about and the students, right? This is also affecting the students. I think about the confirmation bias that comes in. So like if these tools are available and people are can use them, right? Or opt not to use them, right? A faculty member might be like, hey, you're a student who speaks with an accent. You must have used ChatGPT, or you must have used these tools. You could not have written this kind of paper this well. So this is something that has creeped up from time to time where people are like, having these biases where they're just like, like thinking you could not have written this paper, as a person of color, right? Or something like that. So I hope it doesn't happen and hope people are more like reflexive of like their impulse to assume, right, and whatnot. And then there's that other confirmation bias where people are just like, oh, I just want to find something that just confirms like my sources, my beliefs, whatever. And so it creates this sort of interesting dynamic and echo chamber for students to be aware of, that the process of research is to find something that might counter your thinking, that might challenge you to see something differently, and it may or may not necessarily confirm your sources or your beliefs. But one of the things for students to be aware of is that the policy is inconsistent everywhere, in from Maryland to Florida to California, and then within California, the Cal States, the community college, the UCs, they all have different takes. And then within those colleges, let's say at the UC level, music department, education, right? They all have very different policies and takes, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. But this is what I'm seeing that's been really troubling, that we're not sure how do we have a consistent policy that students are aware of how to use it responsibly, when to use it, or if they need to use it. And so I think one other aspect that comes in is that there is this aspect of information privilege. So it's a critical LIS, library information science concept that is about one's affordances or opportunities, right, based on one's affiliation. So if you have opportunities to go to a university that is well resourced and that is giving you access to something like ChatGPT, because some universities are probably deploying that potentially down the line. And so you will have an advantage to be able to use it because right now these tools, there's a free version and then there's like the premium version, right? And so it's stratifying people who have and do not have. And so that's what information privilege is, right? Did you have to buy your textbooks? Did you have access to a school librarian? Did you have, so if you had these, likely you're going to be doing well, right? Compared to those who might not have. So there's that concept that's being in play that I think more students should be aware of. And I think there's this expectation that you have to use it or because everyone is using it because it's so widely available and convenient, which I think it's worrying and troublesome because it's one that the technology is evolving, yet it's a for-profit tool that has special interests that we can get into, and so that's where it gets kind of tricky. But I'm also worried about students who might be coming in from vulnerable backgrounds, students who might be undocumented, students who might be transgender, and they're using this tool, and maybe they're writing a teaching philosophy statement, right? In my institution, for example, and then that information is being collected, right? If they're using it to check their grammar, to whatever, right? Or to refine their thoughts, and then they're writing about who they are, their positionality. What does that say about these tools that's collecting these data that could potentially have had data breaches, like ChatGPT had one, I think, in May of 2023. And so then it gets pretty scary because that information is being collected. And so I think there's some of that issues I'm kind of concerned about and thinking about. But I think overall, really being like not dependent on them, but it's so hard because there's tools that we use, like smartphones and things like that, and everyone's been really dependent on them to a certain extent. I also wanted to name this issue that we're also seeing, which is this like a conversation I had with Dr. Maggie Mello a few weeks ago about artificial intimacy, like this idea of humanizing AI, and it's pretty daunting to see that. And I understand that that there's a need to get support with these tools that are so readily available, but they're not perfect. And I'm seeing something like last night, 60 Minutes had a segment on chatbots supporting mental health and wellness, and they realize it's not perfect, but like it's something that keeps being used because there's a lack of therapists and counselors. But then that tells me another thing. Well, why is there a lack of therapists and counselors? And so this tool can't really substitute for something that maybe requires actual human connection, but that's a whole separate conversation. But I just feel like there's this encroaching of our well-being and being more connected. And some people might say it's a convergence of being cyborgs. I don't know. But anyway, long story short, I feel like there's a lot of issues that affect our work in libraries that hopefully students are aware of and maybe do some due diligence before like requesting this title after you used an OpenAI or some sort of generative AI tool, right? That creates the citation for you. So think about that as well. So
Thank you, Ray. That's a very interesting point. I also did listen to Dr. Maggie Mello's talk about artificial intelligence and intimacy, which I thought was a really interesting point. Um, I think Inside Higher Ed had also recently posted an article about how a lot of schools, high schools, are using AI counselors now for students who are trying to apply to colleges, which is concerning, but also highlights the fact that there is this need for schools that aren't as privileged to have one-on-one counseling with a human being to provide that kind of like closeness. Um, so one aspect that I feel like that isn't discussed as much or talked about are the environmental implications and ramifications of AI usage. Next slide, please. So the next question is, you've researched and spoken on the environmental impact surrounding AI. Can you elaborate on this topic for those who might not be aware?
yeah, thank you for that, Joe. I also want to add, based on another concern It's about copyright too, which we can probably get into, the lawsuits that are happening from New York Times, comedians, Getty Images, and it's like it could change things. So we're dependent on these tools to a certain extent, but then like things can sort of unravel in different ways. And then the whole idea of plagiarism, which we can probably talk about and so forth. But in terms of environmental impact, I haven't spoken as much, but I know that it's definitely one that is top of people's minds, especially scientists thinking about AI usage and sort of the capacity in creating carbon footprint. So is it in conflict with our values in librarianship? Let's say sustainability. Certainly, we can have that conversation. I think what we're seeing is that there's more carbon dioxide emissions because of these computing facilities that require these large language model servers, storage, and to use these text-based chats, it requires um, more and also video conferences, more bandwidth, right? As opposed to in-person meetings where you're flying, and that's another issue. So it's really unclear at the moment in terms of the long-term effects. But certainly we're seeing that issue playing out where, for example, the Association of College and Research Libraries, they release their legislative agenda, right? Every year. Each year they do this. And so I was a member for the past 2 years, not recently, but last year, and we put down data centers, right? So data centers as of 2020 account for as much as 1% of global energy consumption, which doesn't seem like a lot, but this was before like the unraveling of these tools coming in and making themselves available. And then so they're doubling the energy costs of these utilities since 2010. And there's been a lot of tracking of this. And then it's increasing another fourfold by 2030. 2030 is 6 years from now. It seems like it's far from now, but it's coming, right? So as we're seeing more demand for cloud computing grows with AI, it's going to create more global data center infrastructures that's needed, and it's going to create some issues. So what are we seeing in terms of regulation? I think there's some discussions, certainly from acts that are coming in as the Energy Act of 2020, the Energy Efficient Government Technology Act, and so they're being passed in the House, but in the United States, but they're being sort of stalled within the Senate level right now. But the whole issue is that we're seeing this play out where it will have environmental effects, and certainly, it's one that a lot of people should be thinking more about and talking about. But I also want to say, in parallel to this issue, this is a similar issue, which is thinking about environmental issues, labor issues too, right? We're thinking about, for instance, that these prompts, you're using these tools and then they're creating really interesting responses. They actually require people involved, right? Content moderators, like we see in Meta, content moderators where they recruit people based in somewhere like Kenya, right? Because then there is this labor issue where they're able to pay, for example, $2 an hour to view like and ensure that the responses are correct. But then they're also looking at how problematic some of the responses are before we get to see it, right? So it's disturbing content that's happening that now there's a lawsuit, right, from people suing these AI firms to ensure that well, you're forcing the laborers to really examine these countless hours of disturbing content, and then they're being underpaid, and there's some form of exploitation. So then we're sort of like looking at this other issue happening, this issue that's related to environmental as well, but also this well-being of what we're asking people to do to use these tools. So I just wanted to bring that up as well because that's also one that I've been following and thinking about along with the environmental.
Thank you for shedding a light on those issues. Again, I feel like it's not very talked about. You hear a lot about copyright and you hear a lot about, whether or not it can be used to cheat in school, but I feel like the environmental issue isn't stated often enough. So again, I appreciate your take on this. Several librarians and educators have also talked about, voiced their opinion that AI can be extremely beneficial to those who are neurodivergent and have different learning styles or abilities. You had also mentioned ESL students using AI as well. Given the fast-paced, ever-changing landscape of AI tools such as ChatGPT, what is the most important need-to-know information you would like to communicate to students regarding the potential of AI and ChatGPT?
Yeah, I appreciate this question. I also want to build off. There is this interesting dynamic, this tension we're seeing because the PBS NewsHour had a segment a few weeks ago sharing that My Radar, for example, this company is tracking climate crisis issues using AI, right? By creating a weather forecasting project using tiny satellites with AI to detect fires long before they are out of control, right? So AI is being used for like climate adaptation and for mitigation purposes. And this is also being studied at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California using AI to really source out green energy sources. So then it's like a tool like this will require a lot of data servers and storage, right? Creating that issue, but then it's also being used potentially for something that might help us to address some of these other issues. So it's sort of like a really deep trade-off. And so I think it's important to think about that, right? This importance of using these tools that could potentially, address a lot of these issues. Maybe they're not generative AI, but there's some other form of AI being used. And so I think one of the things we need to think about in response to this question about need to know information to communicate to students regarding the harnessing of the potential of AI and ChatGPT. So there's that data collection I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of collecting. You need to have an account. You need to use your phone numbers and so forth. And if you're a premium user for ChatGPT, then you put in your credit card, right? And then you're like using it, right? That's great. But actually think about it for a second. There was a breach that happened. They're collecting information. The data that's being collected, also who's using them, is not neutral, nor are the technologies, right? They're not neutral. They have a specific intent of ensuring that, they get more users using them and being reliant on them. But it could become some other issue that I am afraid of, which is thinking about what happened, for example, like LexisNexis, right? And they're collecting information and then being a data broker and then selling it to the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And this happened a few years ago. And there was a lot of protests and outrage because this is like a database, legal research database. How can it be doing this sort of selling data? And it's happening. And so Library Freedom Project, plus Library Futures, and so many other groups were like talking about this issue, raising concern. And so I see that issue potentially because these systems, these AI tools are in a way data brokering, right? They're collecting data and then figuring out what people are asking, what they want, and then creating profiles. So there's that. And then there's the deep fakes, the hallucinations, but more so with the audio, visual, and multimedia that's distorting reality. And this is a conversation I've had with journalist friends like my friend Jack Van Antwerp. We gave a presentation about deepfakes and what libraries and journalists should be doing to address them. I see this issue sort of coming in, and that's going to be really, really challenging for students or anybody to really discern what is real and what is not. Like we just talked about, just the scholarly aspect of it, which is using fake citations that are scholarly in publications, right? And they're not sure if this is something that it really exists, right? But actually it doesn't. But then let's look at what's going to happen later on with just in general, the manipulations, the deep fakes of the photoshops, the miscaptionings, all of that, and AI being part of that. But then I've also heard that AI can be used to sort of analyze, verify, and sort of flag if it's a deep fake. But there's going to be a lot, so we're going to have to see. I also see two other issues here. Like I mentioned, there's this artificial intimacy that's happening where we're humanizing AI, so we have to be really careful. And I'm so sort of perplexed at how where we are right now in the United States, where there's a lot of dehumanizing language towards immigrants, LGBTQ folks, migrants, refugees, but then we're humanizing AI, right, for like these mental health and wellness. So it's sort of like really, really interesting and sort of like complicated and a little disturbing. That there's actually people, right, that's sort of like there's this dehumanizing language that's happening in politics. And one other area I want to say is that we're seeing the lack of social science and humanities values and majors across higher ed. Like this is a concerted effort to dismantle the values of these areas. But then we're seeing the rise of technologies, the rise of people just focused on AI or computer science or being technologists without the background of maybe it being a humanist, a social scientist. And why is that important? Because if you're thinking of the injustice that's happening, of the human condition, the traumas, the experiences, social scientists and humanists, that's what they do. They examine that and then they try to understand and make sense of it. But then if you're lacking that training and that background and those values, and you're just focused on technology, you're likely not going to treat people the way people should be treated, right? And so this is something I'm seeing, this sort of maybe correlation. I don't know if, or maybe that's too much of a strong word, but this sort of tension that there's a lack of these majors and defunding of these programs, but then more support for computer scientists and so forth. And The Atlantic had an article recently. This was brought to my attention by Associate University Librarian Bo-hyun Kim, who asked about this article. Universities have a computer science problem, the case for teaching coders to speak French. And so the article itself really talked about how computer science majors doubled, while like areas in humanities aren't picking up that level of interest. But then what's interesting is that there's sort of like a focus on machines rather than people, and so the article sort of examines different colleges and what's going on. And I think it's going to be really, really complicated to focus on this area because it's profit driven, that students just want to major in computer science or programming because that's where they'll make money, and then disregard the humanities. But this is what we really need too, right? To intersect and understand the injustice. And then the article also sort of says that there are programs like University of Michigan, which is where Bohyun is from, as a librarian, and in that Michigan school, they're sort of focusing on recruiting people with humanities backgrounds who be in computer science, right? Because it's important to understand how we use computers to solve problems, but also to like incorporate the experiences of humanities and social sciences. So I see hopefully students who have different backgrounds might want to do both, right? Or some other areas, but just to recognize that there is dismantling of humanities and social science in higher education, which is causing this problem for many other people in the future, as we're seeing technologists designing these tools without that framework. So that's what I wanted to share.
I appreciate you talking about that disconnect, right? It is concerning seeing that there's so much interest in technology, but not as much focus on the humanities, which is what is needed to sort of use these tools like AIs more ethically. Next slide, please. So considering that, um, are there any questions from the audience? I know there's one in the chat. From a librarian perspective, what are the three emerging AI tools faculty scholars in any discipline need to explore and need to teach their students?
Yeah, I think it really depends what discipline, what the parameters are, and what kind of assignment you want students to be working on, right? To address that goal. So if you are a systematic review librarian or health sciences and you're into that, there's definitely going to be some tools, but it's not perfect and it doesn't follow the Cochrane or some sort of protocol of systematic review. So there's some issues. I wanted to share that. I know this question will come up later in our conversation, that we would actually at my institution like look at some of them critically, right, as a tool of interrogation, as opposed to something that actually supports or complements, because I think that helps the teachers think about this in their own workplaces and classrooms. But in terms of like tools that people are using, I'm open to hearing Joe, Jasmine, Lorraine, or anybody else what they use in terms of these engagement with their students.
Personally, I tried using Kenius actually, because I had heard from like a conference that a librarian had used it, and they thought that it could be pretty helpful for students who are trying to look for particular articles that have to do with their research or what they're interested in. Um, I can see the use for it, but again, it's a lot of data scraping, right? So like there's always that concern when using these kinds of tools. Well, is this the right tool to use for what I'm trying to accomplish? But I would love to hear from others as well. In fact, we have a question that just came into chat. It says, as a professional, community, and social science discipline, how do you see library and information science practice and theorizing contribute to this conversation in AI?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Melissa and Joe, for sharing that. So I certainly see the work we do in LIS is integral in terms of discovery, in terms of ensuring people have access to information. And so AI is a manufactured, right, sort of design tool that creates information, whether that's original or proprietary, that's in discussion, but rather just like another sort of consideration. Some people had said, oh, it's like Wikipedia, or it's like a search engine, right? It's like these types of other transformative tools or resources that we've seen in the past. And yes, and also like the tool is evolving in different ways, using different large language models and depending on the type of AI. But I think for LIS folks, we need to continue having such conversations to educate because we teach a lot of times, whether you're at the circulation desk or in a classroom or on virtual chat or in email, right? We educate people. So people are going to come to us because they know that library information science is a trusted resource. Not saying the others aren't, but rather this is something that we do a lot. We verify information. We have the aggregate content that we gather through our databases that are credible, authoritative, and we have the training. All of us, library workers, regardless of your type, whether you're a student worker who's been trained to help address the users or a library worker in different roles, different subjects, we have to have a responsibility to educate ourselves and others, and so the best way is to teach, the best way is to learn and engage. So I think for us, we need to think about this lens critically, and we're interdisciplinary. Like, even though we might be classified in some areas like social science or education, we're really interdisciplinary. We have folks who are involved in STEM and involved in arts and humanities or involved in agriculture, right? And guess what? These tools are also like hitting different areas, right? So we need to be really engaged and thinking about them because um, when we have these conversations with our faculty, like I did, people are like, "Wow, you really know a lot." But I actually feel like, no, I don't. And deeply, it's because I have inherent imposter syndrome. But that's a other side conversation. But this is because I felt like I need to be that collaborator, be that thought partner for my colleagues who aren't sure what to do and don't have the bandwidth to think through this and help them sort of like, hey, think through these issues together. So I think that's what we're really good at because our work in libraries is building relationships and making those connections with our communities.
Thank you, Ray. I definitely relate to the inherent imposter syndrome. But I think that, like you said, the work that we are doing is extremely important and very collaborative. And if anything, it's helping us guide the conversations in the right direction. We have two questions here asking about specific AI tools. The first question says, what do you think about Elicit, which I believe is an AI tool that's supposed to help with research processes and workflows? And then the follow-up question is, two tools I see getting attention are Consensus and Elicit. Do you have any experience with these?
No, I don't, and I'm so glad you shared them, John and Maria, because I'm going to be exploring more of these in my institution. Maybe doing these technology petting zoo hour to hour with my colleagues to talk about them and to talk about their limits, right? And to talk about like maybe we have to be careful how we use these tools. But I don't. But if anyone else has, please feel free to share in the chat.
Yes, thank you so much for your questions. I do want to keep an eye on time. If there are any additional questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. Maria says, Elicit summarizes articles and compares articles. Yes, okay. So Elicit does sounds like it would be a very useful tool for researchers to use. Again, if anybody has any opinion on Elicit or their experiences, please feel free to share them. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and move right along. Next slide, please. Do you believe that students and instructors can successfully utilize AIs and other large language models as learning tools in the classroom with all the concerns and ethical issues that we brought up?
Right, and so it really depends on the class, depends on the instructor, depends on how they're viewing large language models. And so let's look at, for example, school librarians. So April is Happy National School Library Month. In addition to National Library Week, in addition to the eclipse, there's so many things happening today. But I just want to say that for school librarians, especially as we know in the K-12 spaces, schools are going through a lot of hard times in terms of funding and attrition and so forth. And so a lot of the school library workers are using these tools because it helps complement the work that they're doing, whether that's helping design some sort of flyer or design some sort of a program that they're doing centered on reading and literacy for their classes. So I think they are using it. They have been encouraging, but I think it's mostly because The root issue is they're underfunded and undersupported, right? And then you have these tools that are available for free. You just create an account and boom, right? Or they're like, monthly charges that are pretty feasible, right? According to maybe their experiences. So then you have this sort of meeting their needs or interests. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that's going to play out. And I just want to say for the large language models, right? They're only as good as the data. So it really is dependent on how it's being used and how up to date, right? So there's going to be some really interesting discussions to be had. I'm going to drop in the chat that this is one that I've used and it's very, very fascinating. It's syllabi policies for AI generative tools, and it's about over, I believe, 90 or so syllabi that's being shared out, crowdsourced by Lance Eden, and who's a faculty member and has done a lot of work sort of getting information from other people, requesting that they're having a statement about AI in their syllabi. And you can see from music to technology to neuroscience, they're all drawing parameters. Some are saying yes, some are saying no, and some are saying use it, but use it for this way, right? So as a result, I think if instructors can be more deliberate about what students can or cannot use to be more specific, I think then it helps them utilize these tools, depending in the policies and if it's aligning to the course's interests and needs. Certainly, we need to think about large language models having really, really complicated issues. So, Stanford University, the human-centered AI group, put out this article recently that is quite disturbing, but also not surprising, which is that large language models like ChatGPT treat black and white sounding names differently. And this was March 25 of 2024, right? And so when we see something like this and people are analyzing it, that's important. And so that means that these tools that people need to be really careful of the biases of the lack of sort of the inclusive nature of the data set, right? Because it's inherent, but also that when you're deploying them, you need to test them out. Like for faculty members, if you're saying in your syllabi like that list of 90, hopefully you've looked at it yourself, right? Because if you haven't used it and you're putting a statement in and then the students are like using it, they might not be aware of these issues. So we need to recognize the disparity, the biases that are coming in. And yet I think I don't think it's going to be successful in a sense of being it subjective, right? Like what does that mean? And just recognizing that the tool needs to have drawn out clear prescription or like some sort of parameter to be used in a way that's meaningful, depending on what class it is.
Thank you very much. I think this segues perfectly into our next question, actually. Next slide, please. Your piece, Generative AI Tools and Surveillance Issues, a reflection in the ALA Social Responsibilities Roundtable newsletter, discussed not being able to completely divest from using tools such as the Google and Microsoft suites. In addition, you stress the importance of preparing ourselves for best practices for the classroom. Can you give us some ideas about how to approach this ethically?
Yeah, I think this is one that we need to understand the trade-offs. We need to have conversations with different folks and understand everyone's risk and comfort. Maybe I might be uncomfortable with a student who is coming from a background, right, with families who are maybe undocumented, but maybe they might be comfortable, right? And it's not for me to say, right? So we have to understand that everyone will have different comfort and interest and risks. And so it's thinking about the issues of like smartphones, right? It's sort of like how smartphones are listening to our conversations all the time, and then suddenly you get a targeted ad because you said something like, "Oh, I need to get new soap," right, or something, and then you're gonna get more of this. So I think it's gonna be really really complicated to sort of disentangle, and I also see the issues of these other tools that are happening, like a lot of people tend to be using a tool like Grammarly, which has AI features embedded to correct one's writing and so forth. And now they have this Grammarly Go feature and so forth, all these other new features that are more AI embedded. And so that means that if you're using these tools, but then you're like not allowing people to use other tools, it's going to create some confusion. Going back to the first question, right? If you're going to be specific, right, about what the parameters are. But in terms of like how to approach this ethically, I think people just need to be aware and be mindful. I think there are unfortunately trade-offs that does not work in the sense of completely divorcing yourself from these tools, from AI in general. Because even in Zoom, right, there's embedded feature of AI. Even when we do our research using something like transcription, like Otter AI, right? It's like needed. So what does that say when we say we want to use AI tools ethically? That means we want to be responsible, we want to understand the ethical considerations, the implications, but also like how we do to improve the AI tools. So as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Fei Li from Stanford University says it's going to take a long time. The data needs to improve and be better, and that requires more inclusion of people of color, LGBTQ, women, etc., to be from marginalized backgrounds traditionally, right, from the AI space, to be in the workforce, to come in with those lenses and perspectives, including more humanities and social justice, social science backgrounds, to really understand this and have conversations from interdisciplinary perspective, philosophy and computer science or anthropology. They're going to look at this issue very differently depending on their situation. So hopefully more conversations to be have that we continue experimenting, I think, to a certain extent with these tools and understanding what the limits are, but understanding that they are not neutral. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ray. I'm taking a look at time. I think now would be a good point to actually pause for audience questions. If anybody has any additional questions they didn't get a chance to ask earlier, or you have some new questions based on the conversation we've been having, please feel free to either unmute yourself or type your question out in the chat. If nobody has any questions, we have some additional questions in the slides, so no worries. I just wanted to give everyone a chance to ask any final thoughts. Oh, we do have a question. Do you have a link to the SRRT article? Yes, we will definitely send that out in the chat. Let's see. You're very welcome. Yep. Are there any additional questions? Oh, thank you, Ray. All right. Well, if there aren't any additional questions, we can just move right along. The next slide says, in generative AI tools transforming the library, rethinking possibilities and questions for the Charleston Hub. You mentioned this as a perfect time to explore opportunities to teach algorithmic literacy. Are there resources you found that would be useful to instructors and enlightening for students?
Yeah, I wanted to backtrack and say that this algorithmic literacy is becoming more important. And what we're seeing now is universities like Cornell University Libraries, and I'm gonna make sure to drop the link there. They've done really great work in algorithmic literacy. And I think there's an IMLS grant right now that they're exploring that's connected to this issue of algorithms and ways for us to engage with students to and learners to think about the issues of algorithms that are um, creating and sort of perpetuating these issues that we're seeing, whether it's harmful content or just creating a lot of biases and so forth. So I think I would look into later this grant and see how it's happening. But I also see a lot of folks teaching. I have a friend, Richard Cho, a librarian at UC Irvine. He taught something really interesting when I went to this conference last year in CCLI, talking about sort of the algorithms of different platforms like Spotify, right? And then comparing it to like a search engine like that we normally teach students, database maybe. And then he helped students sort of understand how the algorithms would work within Spotify. And I thought that was really fascinating because like if you find a way to connect and relate to what students are doing on a day-to-day or what they're exploring in their non-academic free time, chances are that they'll be more attuned. Like I think another example was Instagram, right? The algorithms there, right? And social media, and then connecting it back to how it sort of feeds into this conversation with some of the databases. So I see different ways of that kind of engagement that could be fun, creative, and also informative.
Yes, I definitely know that I've done a little bit of co-teaching with Jasmine myself, and we've definitely found students to be more engaging when we can relate and use the actual like software that they're using to teach the lessons in class. So thank you for bringing that up. Next slide, please. So thinking of that, how would you recommend introducing AI as a possible tool to integrate into library services for librarians and library workers who are cautious, rightfully so, about harnessing this technology and bringing it into their respective galleries, libraries, archives, or museums?
Right, and so there are many groups exploring this issue. Library Freedom Project is one, and they've had all these really great privacy measure resources, free webinars, and it's a great community group. So I encourage folks to check them out. Prioritizing privacy, it's a IMLS funded and I think Mellon funded project from librarians Lisa Hinchliffe and Dr. Kyle Jones, which is looking at learning analytics. And that's something that is a whole separate issue that's kind of related, which is looking at how higher ed is using more learning analytics to predict or to like assess student success, learning outcomes, and then how that's like encroaching in privacy spaces, right? If you're collecting data, et cetera, to extent of auditing who's collecting the data and for what and for how. For just in general GLAM spaces, look at what's going on. For example, the Smithsonian, they have the values focusing on AI and what it means to be using these tools. I had this conversation a while ago with a different museum group about it, and I see opportunities for us to create statements that align with our values because we have to understand our core values, whether it's something you use from ALA, the American Library Association, or something from another organization, it's enduring, right? But they change from time to time. They will have to change. But for the most part, they're enduring. But the technology changes, right? When the technology changes, and then we have to see how it aligns to our core values. I know I had a conversation a few weeks ago that if for folks who are in technical services, the space that is really largely impacted too, in addition to the public service work, that they can consider thinking about this tool in a way that helps them maybe processing government documents, right? And that's something that I mentioned to a colleague, Annie, from the Chapman University. Like we were just talking about digital born government documents and using AI tools to catalog, pull out the bibliographic records because it's intense. Those government document records. So shout out to those who are doing that work, managing that work, or providing resources or service to access that. It's difficult, but there's a way to engage, and potentially with more open data, right? Like how do you make sense of it? So I think there's going to be a lot of conversations happening later this year, just understanding the parameters and what your bandwidths are and capacity. Now, the ALA Intellectual Freedom Committee that I'm a liaison part of has been looking at putting out some resources out there later too. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We do have about a minute left, so we're going to try to squeeze this last question in. Next slide, please. I think you had mentioned earlier in the conversation, Ray, that California legislation is requiring media literacy, which I think is wonderful, and AI usage guidelines in your libraries and how different policies are going to vary throughout different departments. So the last question is, does your institution have AI policies and guidelines in place, which I believe you said you did? What considerations do you think other higher education institutions should consider as they navigate and implement their policies regarding AI usage?
Yeah, thank you so much for this last question. I wanted to say, worked in a task force after getting folks being more aware of the nuance of AI tools because you can consult with AI like you consult with Wikipedia or maybe with a faculty member, right? Does that count? Like, to what extent does that sort of have implications. So we started understanding this issue and wanted to create a task force to create an evolving document statement. So meaning that it's not completely static, but rather one that will sort of get feedback from faculty and students about these tools. One that suggests that you're free to explore. We encourage experimentation, but do be aware of the disclaimer, the biases, the third party usage of these tools, because we're not liable, right? Because these are tools that are out there. It's an opt-in process. Unless your instructor says completely no, you can't use them. And also, like, if you do use them, you cite them. You cite them. That's straight out. There are APA guidelines on how to cite these tools. And then you paraphrase. You paraphrase the prompt because then it indicates that you understood these tools. Now, it can't be used for every assignment, right? These tools are meant for feel like more exploratory, expository writing. But in general, it's sort of like one that we put out there and that we're going to be investigating. So I think it's important for folks in the library, if your institution has no statement, maybe the library can partner, right, and sort of work and support with other departments and create some sort of working statement with folks to understand where it's going and potentially revisit. So at least you have something, because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of institutions might not have anything. I'm an adjunct instructor for PCC, as I mentioned earlier. There's no guidance, right? And so it's sort of interesting to see what's going to happen later on if people are just being left to their own adventures to sort this out.
Great. Thank you so much for your input on the importance of having some kind of policy or guidelines in place, especially for the students. We are about a minute over time. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.